move on to penalty clauses. How often during the procurement, well, not the procurement process, during the contract period, has a penalty clause been claimed by your department?
I would have to check Ms Edge. I wouldn't know. They are available in a number of our contracts. I'd have to get you the answer. Sorry, I just couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Mr. Robertshaw.
So back to this thing about where procurement belongs and departments. We just for clarity, this really. So we have the sort of up to 10 to 100 and above, and we talked about maybe consolidating procurement more closely in one more professional, focused organisation. My question presumed that certain operational procurement would remain with departments. You understood my question in that regard?
Yes, I did.
Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Paul Moulton.
Just an issue that I became aware of reading the National Audit Office report that's just been published, which is the issue of political interference and how the National Audit Office is mindful of how projects are procured and delivered to avoid unnecessary political interference. I just wondered, have you any experience of undue political interference during the procurement process?
In my time as the Chief Executive of DoI, the answer would be no. Have I had occasion to warn people that if they proceed down a certain line they would be struck out? The answer is yes. So you do occasionally get people saying, well, I'll and they might say, well, I'm going to speak to my MHK about this. To which the answer is, if you seek to circumvent the process of the financial regulations through political, it's provided for in the regulations and in our contracts. You cannot do that. No one's losing their right to seek their support of their MHK as a representative, but asking for an MHK or an MLC indeed to intervene in the award of a tender is specifically addressed.
And I suppose the question could come the other way around. What's the political interface with the procurement activity?
And that goes back to, I think, Mrs. Paul Wilson, to an earlier point about what we need to be conscious of doing is making sure that we've distilled the policy achievement, the policy objective we're trying to procure against. And you perhaps used the earlier example, didn't you? Are we trying to buy something that's greener or more accessible, or etc., etc.? So that we're beholden to identify that and to construct a specification that meets that need. So that's a proper example of political involvement. It's a minister or member saying, in delivering this project, I want to make sure, let's take an example, for example, that we provide adequate parking for the people who are going to be displaced, or that we provide good relationships with the business community. And those are examples from another scheme recently, and they're things that we'd want to do again. And if a minister said to me, on the prom you did this with a stakeholder representative, I think that worked well, could you do that on your next scheme? That would be entirely proper that we made that role provided for. If we were to contract it out, though, we might do it ourselves.
And do you think that process is robust enough, though, to actually take account of those legitimate policy objectives and set them out clearly? It goes back to fairness and transparency.
It does, and I think the answer is yes, but of course it's proportionate. We wouldn't pretend. I can't see the involvement of the political level of, what are we, if we're painting a classroom, I should say there's almost, the objective is clear, is it's got to be properly maintained, isn't it? And cutting hedgerows, it's got to provide for visibility whilst not damaging wildlife. But the bigger the project, and if you look at some of the large ones like the ferry terminal, so if we look at the ferry terminal example, the actual scope of the building and what services it would provide and how many people it would cover and what the waiting time should be and how much queuing space should be, they're all things that absolutely there should be a political involvement in. What are we trying to deliver here? Are we delivering something that's the gateway to the Isle of Man, which was what was determined, or are we just moving the porter cabins we've got now and dumping them in a new bit of dock? So that drove the whole project.
How do you manage conflicts of interest within the department?
Conflicts of interest are required to be declared. So we have various processes that are part of our annual declarations that go into our accounts about conflicts of interest, and indeed there was recently a question on those. Was it one of yours, Ms Edge? I think it was. So that's one issue. Generally speaking, the Isle of Man is blessed with a community with lots of linkages and relationships between people. We expect people to declare an interest and step out if there's a conflict.
And do you keep a register?
If people declare interest, yes.
That's
Like you, Mr. Black, I've been around the public service for a little while now, and I found in preparation for this session a slideshow that I went to, so old that it probably was called a slideshow, on sustainable procurement back in 2007 by Ian Cool. And there's one in there called an overview of the current procurement situation, and identified limited partnership-based procurement within government, missing opportunities to enable corporate sustainable purchasing savings and efficiencies, percentage of business based on suppliers' terms, and large numbers of low-value orders at high transaction costs. Do you think we've solved those problems yet?
I think we've done a number of them. I suspect Mr. Cool must have retired not very long after that, but so, for example, the across government, the shared services have definitely helped there. When we took over, and I use Fleet as an example I'm familiar with, there were still departments going down to a local garage with an order book and saying, "Can I buy 2 cars, please?" Mm-hmm. And you just think, oh, and they paid the list price because there was they didn't have the ability to say, well, actually, we're going to buy 100 cars this year, and let's talk. So those things, I think, have been done. Have we done better at suppliers' terms? Yes. The move to centralised procurement has definitely improved. There's been a model contract from the very start. They were drafted when shared procurement moved to AGs. They're varied regularly, but there's been a model contract, model terms. So I think it's now, and of course, as we've mentioned, we have to now get permission to use suppliers' terms. So I think that's been significantly improved on. So would we have scored, half of Mr. Cool's list? It sounds like we've got a good way into it. Have we finished it? It sounds like we've still got a few to do.
You mentioned about vehicle procurement, which reminded me about a point that was made to me about a number of Zoes that were parked at Ellerslie that were barely moved over the course of a year because there was no infrastructure to charge them anywhere else on the island, and so they remained wholly underutilised. That, again, seems like another gap in cross-departmental thinking here.
You're right. They originally were effectively of limited use because of the lack of charging points, but they are flying about the island now within the speed limit and quietly going their way. So we were trying to become a fairly, not perhaps we'd be fair to say a very early adopter, but we were trying to get into electric vehicles. We were asked to purchase some, we were given a specific budget to purchase some, but you're right, the charging infrastructure has taken longer. As you know, there's one now outside your own offices there, and it is now there. We have always worked with the MUA. Yes, those vehicles should have been in service quicker, or we should have bought them later. But we got the vehicles as soon as we got the charging all connected up and done. So that was not great, I agree, but they are now in use, and we're buying them in increasing numbers, and they are helping with our response to the climate challenge.
I think the trouble is, of course, we do that, the warranty's gone and you haven't even used it. It's been parked there.
I don't know if those were time-based warranties or mileage-based warranties, but I've not had any reports of them being problematic in service.
In terms of the capital budget process for the department, does the capital budget for any given year match up with an itemised list of what's going to be purchased in that year?
Are you thinking particularly in terms of fleet? So some capital budgets are specific for a project, as you know. So we have a budget for the ferry term, we have a budget for the promenade, we have a budget for Pulrose Bridge, we have a budget for, and those are voted through by you and your colleagues each year. So yes, that absolutely matches, because that goes through the capital process, whereby, as you know, there are the stages, and the price is, there's an outline price, it's worked through, it's refined, that goes into the motion as an amount provided.
So fleet.
So
fleet, that one out differently?
The fleet budget is segregated. So, for example, if you said to me, what are we likely to buy against next year's fire engines, part of it, I can tell you it's 3B type appliances. If you ask me what's going to happen with the ambulances, I know we've got one already on order and one that we think we'll need to order. So the ambulance budget will buy 2 ambulances. And as you look at some of our larger budgets, no, I can't give you a list of exactly what's going to be on next year's.
So that within fleet?
within the fleet. So we have multiple budget lines within fleet. So we have general procurement in terms of the buses, and of course next year, I've got to be careful, Mr. Watson. I don't want to fall into any sort of trap because the budget isn't voted on by you till February. So these are our intentions. We can't spend it because you haven't given it to us yet.
Well, in fairness, it'd probably be in column 2, so we won't get any say in it anyway. So,
why do you only do the procurement for some statutory boards and not all, like of the MUA vehicles?
We do the MUA vehicles, but because the MUA is funded differently, they're recharged. So that does work differently. So we will buy their vehicles, but they have quite bespoke requests, as you know. And I think we've been talking to the post office about helping them with some of the procurement. That's an offer. As you know, the financial regs don't require the statutory boards to use the shared fleet services, whereas they do require departments to.
So just regards your fleet budget, then, are you able to carry that from one year to the next based on approvals for things that you've had?
Capital budgets can be accrued if we put the provisions through Treasury to accrue them.
That's right, and that's a common practice.
Yes.
Earlier on, you mentioned that there were delays in the process where it was going from yourselves to AGs and back again or whatever. This is an unfair question, so forgive me, but do you happen to know how many AG staff are actually engaged in the process of this work?
Okay, give me 1 second.
Because there are significant delays there, aren't there?
I'm going to use the word currently, and the date this was sent was the 15th of November this year, so I assume it's reasonably current. Currently, the procurement team comprises 2 senior procurement officers at HEO grade, 2 procurement officers at EO grade, 1 at AO grade who is shared with the commercial lawyers. That's the AO, I think, who is shared only. So 2 senior HEO, 2 procurement EO, 1 shared AO. But I am also aware, of course, that there are professional staff as well. So there are legally qualified staff, up to and including Mr. Watson, who leads the team, and then Mrs. Smith, who is the overall executive director above. I think you'd have to put your questions to them about the level of legal resource applied, but I deal with with probably 3 or 4 different people there. So, but as it happened, I asked this question in preparation. So that's the administrative resource.
Thank you. We will, but that's helpful. Thank you.
The professional resource is excluded from my answer, Mr. Robertshaw. So,
just a couple more on fleet. In terms of the department bought a number of minibuses a couple of years back in terms of being able to deliver demand-responsive transport for the north of the island. I was just wondering, do we have statistics on the occupancy level of those vehicles, whether they're being occupied, and how that integrates with the hospital contract and that delivery? Because what I really want to know is how that chimes with the department spending £76,000 on taxis last year.
I can answer those questions for you, but I'm afraid I can't answer them off the top of my head.
Okay.
Because we do have figures for usage, passenger mileage, efficiency, and as I think you already know, Mr. Watson, the vehicles aren't specific to one use, so it might be doing demand-responsive transport at one time, then after it's come out of its next servicing, it might be allocated to hospital work, then it might do a school run. So we are trying to integrate them. There's been a lot of work done recently, and in fact the Minister is currently has had a report, so I'm confident I can get you some figures.
But in broad terms, in principal terms, why is it that with this going on we're still spending £76,000 on taxis?
£76,000 is being spent on taxis across government, so it's not DoI expenditure necessarily. So I'd need to clarify that.
That's from the DoI's budget?
Yes, it's from our budget,
right.
But that doesn't mean it's
your purpose.
I fully respect it's within your remit, but it's not perhaps a procurement question, so I've not come equipped to answer it. That's so fine. If that's okay, I think it's much better I come back to you and say, where is that money being spent and how many people are using the minibuses?
Fine.
I suspect you could have a session on your own, of your own, on that topic. Maybe Mr. Watson and I can talk about buses, but his patronage is respected and much welcome.
Well, in which case buses might be that I'll pick up one question on that, because obviously there's been a picture circulating in the last few days of a skip down at Bank Circus. You'd be disappointed if I didn't ask you about it, so go and tell us why we have a skip full of bicycle racks for our buses, Mr. Black.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure you'll allow me to pick you up on exaggeration. I don't know if that means I can press my buzzer, but there's not a skip full. 3 racks.
Quarters of it.
There is a skip.
The last unfair question, Mr. Robertshaw.
There is a skip with a bicycle, with one or more bicycle racks in it.
With one or more bicycle racks in it. A bicycle rack costs us £930. They are supplied from the United States, where front-mounted bicycle racks are common. They're not, as you know, in use in the UK. We wanted to experiment with active travel. We do believe that people would like to cycle to a bus, carry on the bus, and then perhaps finish their journey on a bicycle. Not everyone can cycle the whole way back to, say, Castletown, Ballasalla, up to the top of Onken, but we think there's a role for it. Electric bikes are paying part of it. You all know that active travel has been very much politically supported, and that there are a lot of people who are wishing to see us push forward. So we bought 3 racks as a trial. They were mounted on the front of the vehicle, and we asked our drivers what they thought. We asked various people what they thought. I myself had a view, and our conclusion was this just isn't going to work for us. And we tried to send them back to the manufacturer, but posting them back to the States was an expensive business, and in the end it was better simply to just get rid. We couldn't sell them anywhere in the UK. They'd been opened, they'd been fitted, it was a used item, and we don't blame the manufacturer for not wanting them back again.
But for £2,790 worth of taxpayers' money, did we ask the bus drivers and all of that first, before they were... because clearly, pictures would have been available, and
of course, Mr. Watson. And look, I'm better off answering for myself. I knew that they were being purchased. I had seen a picture. I suspect you know, Mr. Watson, because I've probably seen you. I drive service buses as needed to support service delivery if I'm called upon. I suspect in this forum I will make it clear that I don't get paid a penny for that. I'm quite happy that's within my normal terms and conditions, and I only do it in emergency when we're stuck or to keep my competence up. However, that is a role I will undertake if needed. I sat in the seat with 2 racks in the bike and 2 bikes in the rack, and I said, I don't want to drive this. I didn't feel that it was the right option. It's slightly in your visibility line. Other driving colleagues, driving a bus around the Isle of Man is not an easy job, and I, all joking aside, Mr. Watson, I respect the fact you're a regular passenger. We value your customer, of course, but you understand if you're taking a bus through the middle of Castletown in TT week, you don't want bikes on the front sticking out. Absolutely. So could we have done that first? Possibly, but actually there's an element of sit in the seat and see. I thought it might work. I sat in the seat, I looked at it, and I thought, no, I don't think this is going to work. It wasn't just my view. I may be the accountable officer, but I'm the driver of last resort. So
I think a lot of pedestrians might have been scared by the prospects as well.
And then we had to say, well, what about... there was a process for loading the thing on. You had to load it on, pull a spring-loaded lever, release it at the right time so your bike was secure. And although it might be a surprise for people like some of us, there are people who pay £5,000 for a bicycle, and would you want that to be the crumple zone?
This all seems sort of reasonably foreseeable, is I suppose the challenge I throw at you.
I think we could spend more than £2,700 arguing about whether it was the right thing to do. But the reality, Mr. Watson, is that we've looked at it, we've explained it, we tried it. There's a balance between, in all parts of the work we do, trying new ideas and being afraid of scrutiny and ridicule. So there's...
Can I ask a question then? Because I'm fully supportive of the department trying new things. But in terms of the trial, you've done a trial. Is there a piece of paperwork somewhere, some kind of report where you've documented actually how it went, the cost of the trial, how it went, feedback? Because again, we had this issue with the mobility scooters on the buses where you did a trial, but actually there's no record anywhere of that trial. So you're telling us here this was the feedback we got, but actually there's no way of holding up something and says actually here's the trial and we did it. And I completely get. We absolutely want to encourage a department to crack on and try new things, and when they work, that's brilliant. When they don't work, actually it's more important that we learn from why they didn't work so we can apply those learnings going forward, and it's really hard to do that if there's nothing to pin your hat on.
I absolutely understand the general principle and the link to another issue, Mr. Hooper, and I'm not surprised at your point. In this case, I was personally involved, and I have sat here in front of you today and explained it, and that to me is a fair record of the department's decision. It was my choice. I'm happy to stand up for it. Is there a piece of paper? I don't know. I can happily look for you, but it was some time ago, and there may or may not be. But I'm happy to do it. But I have told you.
I was talking more about in terms of a process for doing a trial.
No, I understand it, and I understand the link to the previous issue, Mr. Hooper.
And sorry, just building on that, I understand, Mr. Black, you're the accountable officer and you're explaining to us, but actually it would help all of us if we saw feedback from users, whether they're cyclists, pedestrians, bus drivers. I think when a decision is reached, it's helpful to see the entirety of the the feedback. I think that's the
just
point.
going back to the original thing, if you'd have done a prior information asking, gathering, saying actually the thing we're looking for is a solution to putting bicycles on buses, perhaps someone would have said actually got just the thing and it isn't sticking them at the front of the bus, and you might have come up with some solutions you hadn't ever considered, just to try and bring us full circle.
In generality, Mrs. Barber, the principle is one you have to agree. As you say, to bring us full circle, a contractor might know better. In this case, we employed people who are very skilled and knowledgeable in the management of buses. This is done worldwide. You don't put the rack on the back because that's where the engine cover is, where you have to lift the engine, where the emergency switches are, and a whole range of other reasons. Could you bring them inside? And therein lies another different argument. But I get your general point, Mrs. Barber, as I understand the point made by Mr. Hooper about trials and Mrs.
As it was a change in policy, there must be a policy paper, a pink paper on it, that you could provide to the committee.
Oh, look, Ms. Edge, it's a small point in a long history.
Okay. Well, we'll leave bike racks then, for the general sanity of all involved. To take us back out to a bigger picture element, we've recently been through one of the most difficult, challenging times in recent history in terms of COVID. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say, and the Department of Infrastructure has been very much at the pointy end of that and delivering an awful lot of things very quickly, for which it's to be commended. What sort of lessons do you think that you can draw for wider procurement from the experiences of having to do things and do them now and still present value for money, that perhaps we're missing the rest of the time when we're not in a crisis?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. One of the points goes back to my original one about what are our priorities. And at that time, priorities probably shifted slightly. So one of the things that my colleague delivered for our colleagues in health was oxygen generating equipment. As you can imagine, it was in global short supply. So we managed to find only 2 places that had something for sale, one of which was snaffled by a Nightingale hospital in the UK, and there was one left, and I had till 12 o'clock on the same day, 12 noon, to place my order. And I had my hospital engineering colleagues saying, this is good enough, this is the kit we need, this will do, this will generate this much oxygen and feed this many beds and keep this many people alive. And as I think you'll know from various roles, we had an interim form of governance for expenditure from the Coronavirus Fund, which effectively allowed me to go to a dedicated officer who would very quickly look at it, and with the support of the Chief Secretary and the Chief Financial Officer, a decision could be made quickly. So we felt that the product was a fair price. And I placed the order with probably less than half an hour to spare, gave the authority. But colleagues were very, very quick, and I was able to phone, these are people, of course, I've worked with for years, and say, help. If I don't get the agreement within the next 2 hours, we are never going to get, there are no more. This is the one. Had they not been there, had they not spoken to me, what would I have done? Would I have said, just buy it anyway and I'll try and get the approvals afterwards? And that's a very difficult position for any officer to be in, because you know the right thing to do for your community is we need this. We were told at the time that we should plan for X number of people needing Y amount of oxygen. It wouldn't be for me to question the medical staff who predict that response to pandemic, and I know that you've collectively made clear that the decisions were made on the information at the time. As it turned out, we didn't have wards full of people, but it's still a good job we built Ward 20 because it was occupied by the people from Abbotswood. So it was used. The oxygen was less needed, but we can't tell you, I'm not going to tell you if it's ever going to be needed again. We've kept it operational. So there was a very rapid form of governance. That still provided control of expenditure. I still had to write a case. It was on one side, it was done quickly. It might have even had a spelling mistake in, but it went in and it was done. And I said, this is the price. This is the nearest thing we can price that somebody else will offer. That's how we think it's good value for money. And the approvals were done. So speed was then the essence, not process. Did we work very well together? Yes, we worked very well together. Are there points about working together, seeing people as individual specialists rather than as a job description? Yes. So we used the people we needed rather than said, well, who's in that job? So there were lots of things. I know that the Chief Secretary and the PSC have done a lot of work about saying, what can we learn from that we should carry forward? And I think there will be much more to do. We probably ought to be out of the woods first before we say we've learnt all the lessons. The peak, I hope, has passed, but we're still facing day-to-day challenges, as you all know.
But one of the lessons I heard from that was that actually when politicians get together and actually provide you with a clarity of mission, it can be delivered
absolutely
robustly, and that's part of the challenge.
Absolutely. That was important.
Ms. Edge, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, it's still important, oxygen.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, liquid oxygen is the primary supply to Nobles Hospital. It's a bulk VIE vessels, so that is supplied from the UK. The oxygen generating equipment is used to provide resilience and backup, and is available, absolutely there. So yes, we're still providing it. We use both alternately. We keep both available.
Okay.
Both run.
Thanks. Thank you.
In which case, Ms. Black, thank you very much for a good afternoon talking about procurement.
And other things.
Amongst other things, I much appreciate you coming this afternoon. The committee will now sit in private. Thank you.
Thank you.